When my son and I moved in here, it wasn't as warm as we hoped.
Hi, Justin. It is so great to talk to you. I appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, Kristen. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Well, I got to see this at the premiere. I missed the cape, which I was very sad about.
It was so odd.
It was. I'm curious, what was getting involved with this project like? Is it something as simple as Disney sitting down and saying, pick a ride, we'll let you make that movie? What was the early days of this like for getting you involved?
I'm not there yet where Disney sits me down. Really, it starts with the script. And, it is my pleasure, and it's certainly difficult, but it's my pleasure to talk about the writer here because a lot of stuff's going on. Writer can't speak for themselves. Katie Dippel's script is why I'm here. It was just a phenomenal script. And I opened it with a lot of like, how are they going to pull this off? And why do we need this? And da-da-da. And she answered all of those questions for me immediately. And she told me why we needed this movie right now. She made me laugh. She made me cry. And she kept me up all night being entertained and also asking myself existential questions that I absolutely was not prepared to deal with, reading a theme park ride adaptation script. And I just felt like there was something really special about it that I wanted to protect, that I wanted to bring to life. But even had, in the gaps that you have to figure out as a director, really spoke to the kind of stuff I love to do. It's an ensemble comedy. I love making ensemble comedies. That was my first film. That was my TV series. It has genre flourishes. My TV series, I mean, if you really go into Dear White People, there are some moments we get into horror and noir, all these things. Certainly, I had just made a very practical effects driven, campy horror movie, Bad Hair. It just sort of threaded the needle of all those things that already turned me on as a filmmaker. And then the other piece of it is that like my sense of Blackness is really rooted in Louisiana. That's where my mom's family is from. And I just felt like, the version of New Orleans that I know and that I grew up with is beautiful, and it's Black, and it's there's something political and radical about realizing it properly in a movie like this that I think actually really complements the ride and complements what the ride is trying to say thematically. And those are really kind of like the hallmarks of what I thought I could bring to it. And I just kind of said that over and over again. And, practical effects, Black New Orleans, ensemble comedy. Those are the main beats that I felt like, would realize this wonderful script.
Going off of that, I grew up with the Eddie Murphy version of this story. Guillermo del Toro's version has been widely documented. With those two kind of already setting the tone, how does that challenge you as a filmmaker to go into this material and put your own spin on it? What were the things that you wanted to, I know you touched on a couple of them just in the last question, but I guess working with the two concepts that were already out, what was your way in?
I didn't really pay that much attention to them, to be honest. I obviously knew about them, but my way in was a personal way in. This is a story about a guy who masks his grief with humor. Hello, hi, nice to meet you. My name is Justin, and who sort of has to kind of make peace with the family that he's got. Not the one that he wants, but the one that he's got. And boy, oh boy, is that a story I tell over and over again in my work. So my way in was personal. I thought it would be a gag because I just really didn't expect this to be the movie, you know what I mean? That would come out of this, out of that process. And so, we just kind of charted our own course. That wasn't, I think the pressure of that is really more on the studio to figure out how to market and release the movie and communicate to people what this is. But for me, just as a storyteller, it was very natural and instinctual, how to lean into this.
How did you want to approach the horror element in a way that is accessible to families, but also is still scary, which is paramount in the ride?
Well, I had some touchstones, I talked a lot about, Tim Burton's work, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. We talked a lot about Disney movies. I talked a lot about Snow White and Pinocchio and those sort of classic Disney movies that are quite frightening, not only to children, but to me as an adult watching them now. And actually even more frightening now because I understand the implications of what they're saying, of like what it would mean if, this woman's stepmother murdered her, or like, you know what I mean? Like these things actually like hit a little bit harder growing up. And I sort of just kept leaning on that as sort of a touchstone and recognizing that like, kids can handle a lot, and they want to be told the truth. They want to be at a certain age. They don't want a movie to gaslight them, you know. And these movies sort of stick to your bones when they take you through a really dark experience without flinching, but then they take you to the other side, and they make you laugh a little bit through it, but you move through it. That was my experience riding the ride as a kid. That was my experience watching so many of these movies. And you know, whether we're talking about Little Shop or Ghostbusters or Beetlejuice, so much of why those movies still work today is because, yes, we are being taken to worlds that couldn't possibly exist, but they're made practically, and it's done with lighting and sets and paint and magic. And now we have all this digital stuff, which is amazing. But like, if we start there, we can't go wrong, because this stuff still slaps. Poltergeist still slaps, you know what I mean? And so, you know, there was a lot of really great work out there to lean on.
You were crafting a horror sequence where you had to pull back because they were like, wait, this might be a bridge too far.
Yeah, and thankfully the studio let me shoot them anyway, because when we started testing the movie, there were a couple scenes that weren't in some of our early tests. And I remember there was this one little kid in the front row when they asked, like, is the movie too scary? The youngest kid there raised his hands. He was like, I love the Axe Bride. I want another scene with her. We're like, well, we got another scene with her. And we started to put these things back, and we realized, like, no, the kids love this stuff, and they're not too scared. I also know that I watched Nightmare on Elm Street when I was 5. I didn't know what was happening.
Yeah.
I didn't understand any of the plot. I just thought it was cool. It did not scar me for life. I understood that I was watching fantasy, you know, and I just think kids can handle it. And again, any of the Disney classics, name them. They all have these really traumatic moments in them, and they really take you to some dark and scary places. So there were some folks that were worried. I just wasn't among them, to be honest.
Doing a theme park ride, you know, you have to include the references to the ride or people get upset. I know that I didn't notice the famous singing busts in the film. Were there touchstones for you from the ride that you had to include, and I guess what went into including or not including some of them?
I'll say almost anything you can think of was meticulously researched, if not outright filmed. And at the end of the day, they call it killing your darlings. It's a process that you have to do as a storyteller. You have to decide what of these details tell the story and what of these details slow it down. And the ones that tell the story stay, the ones that slow it down don't. And there's a lot of fighting about it, good creative friction about it. You know, these are darlings, like I said. And, you know, the bus in particular, there were several different iterations of the bus potentially being in the film, but they didn't keep the story moving the way it needed to move. And that was the hard part. But the fun part certainly was the research phase of pulling all this stuff out from the ride, figuring out what it might be in real life, figuring out where their influences came from and what's the historical influence, and mashing them together and coming up with an adaptation. That was a joy, but we're here to tell a story. You know, we're here to take people through a journey that I really didn't want to last 2.5 hours.
You have LaKeith in this hero role. You know, he's a great presence in a lot of movies, but he gets to take center stage and be the hero in this film. When you're conjuring up characters and casting and people you want to work with, I guess, how did you decide who was going to be Ben, and why do you think LaKeith worked so well in that performance? Well,
there was a couple requirements I had. I said Ben has to be a Black person because this movie's set in New Orleans, and New Orleans is an 85% Black town. And I'm not telling a New Orleans story without a Black lead. I'm just not going to do it. So I already sort of like created a list of folks. And what I love so much about LaKeith, and I've just been a fan of his for so long, is that I know him to be a very warm and funny person. And he's always playing these very strange, sort of impenetrable characters that somehow he pulls you in. And I said to him, I was like, you do a thing that Johnny Depp does and did leading up to his sort of moment in Pirates of the Caribbean, except without, you know, the problematicness, but like just sort of like, you know, leading up to Pirates of the Caribbean. Suddenly he's this big leading man, but like he's doing the same thing he was doing up until that point, which is that like he pulls you in. There's a sense of empathy you feel that's happening in the eyes, and it's happening in spite of all the character work and all the prosthetics and all this stuff. He pulls you in, and I saw LaKeith do that role after role, particularly in Judas and the Black Messiah. And I said, like, you're the guy that's going to make me care about someone who doesn't like people and is grieving and is, kind of negative all of the time. Like, you're the guy that makes me care. And I know you're funny, and I know you're charming, and you're hot, and you're ready to be a big old movie star. Let's surprise some people who maybe don't know that side of you. But at the end of the day, like, you're gonna do the assignment. You're gonna bring us into this guy that we have to care about. And so that was the big one with him. And once he fell into place, it was really about making sure the rest of the ensemble was there to counteract that, to accentuate it, to, smash into his energy, to repel against it. We were able to kind of situate everyone else around him once we figured out who the Ben was.